for a long time. But over the last few months, the threats from Russia over Ukraine have gotten worse. The situation in the Middle East has taken a very specifically dangerous turn with regards to the possible use of nuclear weapons or possible conventional attack against the Iranian nuclear site. And the US-China confrontation just seems to be steaming ahead uh, on a collision course. And it, we're getting some more attention to the nuclear issue because of these things, but the attention at this point is still totally inadequate to the enormity of the threat that we're facing. And so we have, I think, a real job to do trying to make sure that people understand fully how dangerous things are and how horrible it's going to be if things go wrong and nuclear weapons get used. And at the same time, be giving people some hope and showing them that there is a way forward, which there is. You know, we don't have to go down this path that we are actively pursuing at the moment as a country. So um, I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the dangers a little bit beyond what I did, and a couple of minutes talking about what's going to happen if the weapons are used, because there is some new stuff coming out that we should be aware of, and then focus more on, what we can do about this. I referenced already the increasing danger of Ukraine, and I don't think that this can be underestimated at this point, overestimated, whatever the right phrasing of that is. You know, we've been assuming that this is all bluster and threat coming from Russia, and it probably is. But the longer this goes on, and the longer the threats go on, the greater the chance that there's some significant misunderstanding and things go awry. And I think we have to help people understand that there really could be a nuclear war between the United States and Russia, something which people of my age, thought had successfully put out of mind 30 years ago with the end of the Cold War. The situation in the Middle East, um, it is clear that despite its best efforts, the Biden administration has little to no leverage over what Netanyahu does. And I think there's real reason to be concerned that he sees this as the moment to try to take out what he perceives as the Iranian nuclear threat to Israel's survival. Um, we don't know what response he's going to make to the missile attack from 2 weeks ago. It will probably happen tomorrow. Um, Tomorrow night and Saturday is Yom Kippur. And I think there's a real chance that this is going to happen before then. Not necessarily, he may wait, but there's been a lot of speculation that that's the timing that is most likely. And we don't know what this response is going to be, obviously, but one of the very possible scenarios is that he chooses this moment to try to take out the Iranian nuclear facilities. And PSR National did a study about this back in 2005. I mean, we postulated then that in order to take out the Iranian nuclear program, would require the use of a nuclear weapon. That so much of the infrastructure around their production facility at Natanz is deeply buried and hardened underground that it would be virtually impossible to do this with conventional weapons. And the scenarios we played it out is really horrifying. I mean, it's an enormous amount of radioactivity is released, not just from the bomb that is used, but from all the bomb grade material that the Iranians have produced and which is stored at Natanz that would also be widely dispersed. Um, it would also, of course, in addition to the immediate direct effects in Iran, break the nuclear taboo, which has been in place since Nagasaki. And again, this is a very frightening development if this happens. Um, the China threat is a little bit less immediate temporally, but you know, Joe Gerson, who many of you may know, sent an email around to those of us in Massachusetts today, reporting on some track two diplomacy conversations that he's been involved in involving Russians, Chinese, and Americans. The whole tenor of that conversation was quite pessimistic, but there's a general consensus that the U.S. and China are both, committed to winning this struggle for who's going to be the dominant power in East Asia. And both at the moment seem to feel that a military confrontation is possible and something that they're willing to countenance. And that somehow or other, each side seems to think that they could win this. which I think is a totally insane assessment of the situation. I can't imagine either the United States or China suffering a major military defeat at the hands of the other and not trying to reverse that defeat by using its nuclear weapons. And this meeting that Joe Gerson was at, also, there was some discussion about the possibility of limiting a nuclear war if it developed. And there was a general consensus. I mean, I think, as he framed it, an overwhelming consensus that that ain't going to happen. That, as we have all feared, if nuclear weapons get used in any great power confrontation, there really is not any break wall that keeps us from developing into a large-scale nuclear war. So it's a very frightening situation. I mean, I think this is the worst it's been since the summer of 1983, or maybe since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And at those times, everybody was tuned into this. Today, I mean, we have a presidential election going on. Nobody's talking about it. So there's obviously an enormous job that we have to do of just alerting people to the danger. With regards to what's going to happen if there is a nuclear war, again, I think we have a lot of work to do. People really don't get it. They have some idea that it will be very bad. They may even use the phrase, it would be the end of the world, but they use that as a throwaway to sort of stop the conversation rather than to really focus in on what's going to happen. And even people in government, maybe especially people in government, don't get it. They at some very abstract intellectual level, they may be able to articulate, what the consequences of a nuclear war would be. But at the sort of gut level that guides our action, they really don't get it. And, I think the physicians movement in particular has a responsibility. We have sort of expertise in this field, and we've generated the data in this field. But all of us, this is not rocket science material. All of us have access to the data about what would happen directly from a nuclear war, what the environmental and climate consequences would be, and what the subsequent famine would do. And we really need to get that material out. Now, one thing that is an upcoming development that may help with that is that Congress commissioned a study which was supposed to have been completed by June 30th, 2022, asking the National Academy of Sciences to look at what the environmental and health impacts would be of the US use of its nuclear arsenal against a potential enemy. Essentially, this is sort of a way of getting the National Academy to look at the data that Alan Robach and Lili Jia and their colleagues have produced, showing the enormous global famine that would follow any significant nuclear war. That study is more than 2 years overdue at this point. It is supposed to be out by the end of the year. I'm skeptical that it will be, but it will be coming out at some point soon. They cannot delay this indefinitely. The draft has been written. It hasn't been sent out for review yet in the peer review process. When that study comes out, if it confirms the very frightening projections for nuclear famine that Lili Jia and Alan Robach and their colleagues have put forward in the scientific literature, if it confirms those findings, it's going to be, number one, a huge news story. Number two, it's going to be really hard for the US government to ignore this warning, which they have tried to do so far with regards to the scientific studies that are out there. And it should become for us a very powerful tool to get people to understand the danger that exists. If the study comes out and is something of a whitewash of the situation and tends to downplay it, I think there will probably be a very vigorous rebuttal from the climate scientists and the nutrition scientists who prepared the 2022 report because they're quite confident in their data. And I think they would rebut that very strongly, in which case, there'll be a role for us also weighing in support of their rebuttal. So this is something that could become a major development probably in the first half of next year, and one which we should just be thinking in our minds how we're going to mobilize ourselves to deal with this. So, in this situation, an enormous and growing threat, unbelievable consequences if the threat comes to pass. The question obviously arises, what can we do about this? And I think we need to both acknowledge how serious the problem is, but also understand that there have been times, 1962, 1983, that were as dangerous as this. And out of those moments a very powerful change in the nuclear policy was brought about. When Kennedy and Khrushchev almost blew up the world in the Cuban Missile Crisis, they both were horrified by what had happened. And we very quickly got the Partial Test Ban Treaty and the establishment of the hotline between Moscow and Washington, and a general improvement in U.S.-Soviet relationships. It was temporary, but it was significant at the time. And then, of course, Kennedy was assassinated and Khrushchev was removed from power. In 83, U.S. and Soviet Union literally almost went to war twice, minutes away from a full-scale nuclear war on two occasions, once in September, once in November. Within 2 years, Reagan and Gorbachev are sitting down saying nuclear war can never be won, it must never be fought. And that was partly because they got it. They finally figured out the dangerous game that they were playing. But that took place largely because there was a movement in this country and actually in the Soviet Union as well, pushing them towards those conclusions. Our job is to try to recreate that movement. It was the freeze in the 80s. And it was a grassroots movement that focused its attention on Washington, but did its work at the grassroots level. Is that they didn't send lobbyists down to DC to try to persuade members of Congress, members of the Senate with the brilliance of their arguments alone, though they did that kind of work. But they mobilized communities around the country to put pressure on Congress. And it was that combination of powerful arguments, which are necessary, but also real constituent grassroots pressure that I think was successful in changing things then. And that's the model that we had in mind when we launched the Back from the Brink campaign. It was an attempt to, as the tagline for the campaign says, unite communities to prevent nuclear war. And it has, I think, reached an inflection point this year. We now, as of yesterday, we've gone to 22 hubs, local groups around the country that have formed specifically around the goal of promoting the Back from the Brink campaign. We've got 8 state legislative bodies, both houses in Oregon, Rhode Island, California, and the Maine Senate and the New Jersey Assembly on board. HRS 77, our congressional resolution, got 44 co-sponsors, which is way more than we were expecting or that others' efforts to mobilize Congress around this issue have gotten in the past. And we've gotten, at this point, 480 NGOs around the country have joined this campaign. We've got 80 cities around the country, 75 cities around the country that have passed resolutions supporting this campaign. And you have this wonderful statewide coalition in Washington. There are only a couple of communities in Washington that have passed Back from the Brink resolutions. It would be fantastic if Seattle or Kings County as a county or any of the communities in the state that have not passed resolutions yet would do that. It would be fantastic if the state legislature in Washington joined Oregon and California to complete the left coast in support of the Back from the Brink campaign. And it would be great if you were able to get members of the House delegation besides Representative Jayapal, who has co-sponsored. I think she's the only member of the Washington delegation that's co-sponsored so far, to get others to co-sponsor the successor bill to HRS 77, which will be introduced in the new Congress. So, again, a bad situation in the world, a real opportunity to do something very significant in terms of changing that. And you guys have got the tools, with your statewide coalition to do that. So looking with great optimism and hope to you to do just that. I'm happy to answer any questions people might have.
You have a question, you can raise your hand or type in the chat.
And Sean, can you unspotlight me so I can see everybody else?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks.
Guli.
Yep. Hi, so first of all, thanks for your speech, and then I definitely agree. I'm Guri from Seattle Rebellion Coalition and Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network in Pacific Northwest chapter. I'm originally from South Korea, and then you mentioned Russia and Middle East and US and China. Also, is North Korea is the one. Even is the recent number from Jacobson is a nuclear war. That's very horrific. So we as Korean Americans is keep working for the Korea peace, even including this denuclearization in North Korea. But it's as a first time using this atomic bomb, US Sharp is a very good example to start with. So I'm also working with this Harry. So I try to working to uh, is a TPNW resolution in our region. And also I'm working with our student and high schoolers at the church. So start a program from next year. So we now is currently is working with these kids. What's this nuclear weapons and what happened in the history and what's the TPNW we start with soon. So you have any kind of advice or recommendation how is Korean Americans join this movement? Because it's Koreans usually they focus on the peace in Korea for and reunification in the peninsula, but it's hardly is recognized any is nuclear issues until this point. But now they pick this some knowledge and then concerns cause really these real threats. So do you have any idea how we more effectively can deliver this to the special community? I mean, specific to its Korean Americans.
Yeah.
If you
Guri,
have
thanks.
any background or some data or
I didn't mention Korea or the other area that's very concerning to me, South Asia, India, Pakistan, and just in the interest of brevity when I was speaking. But the situation in Korea has clearly gotten incredibly much worse over the course of this current year. And it's not at all clear what the answer is there. Um, I think, we have taught the North Korean regime that having nuclear weapons makes sense for them in the short run. We've invaded Iraq, which didn't have them. We've taken out Gaddafi in Libya, who did not have nuclear weapons. And we have um, uh, abandoned the agreement that we had with North Korea in the 1990s, which they had stopped their nuclear weapons program. They have drawn the lesson from this that if they have nuclear weapons, they're safer from a U.S. attempt at regime change. As unpalatable as we find the North Korean regime, I think the United States is probably going to have to figure out with the rest of the international community some way of reassuring the North Korean government that they can give up their nuclear weapons and they're not going to be attacked the next day. And in terms of, I don't know how that sits, frankly, with the Korean community in the United States. I know in South Korea, um, there's a real divide between people who want to confront North Korea and people who want to try to figure out some kind of a rapprochement along the lines I was just talking about. And I'm not sure within the American Korean community in Washington State, where the thinking is at this point about that. But I think I would try to encourage efforts that recognize that reality, um, that we're going to have to, in some way, um, normalize relationships with North Korea. Whether that can lead to reunification at some point in the future is another question. I don't know enough about Korean politics and stuff to comment usefully on that. One thing though, I also want to just thank you for mentioning the students and Harry is working now nationally with Students for Nuclear Disarmament, a high school and college student group that joined that has formed in partnership with Back from the Brink. And it's one of the other really exciting things about the campaign this year that we now have this student group. The other thing, which I also wanted to mention and should have earlier, is we have started to get endorsements from organized labor. 4 unions here in Southern New England have endorsed the campaign, and they're all actively reaching out to other unions in their network. And to me, this is a huge potential breakthrough because organized labor has strength which the traditional peace movement does not. It has members, it has organization, it has political clout. And I think this is something we need to think very carefully about. How do we develop this further? You know, what unions do we know that we can be reaching out to in our efforts to engage people? And we've found the Back from the Brink platform and the way it talks about the TPNW has been something that the unions that we've made presentations to can really support. So, yeah, Joanne.
Yeah, Ira, first of all, welcome to Washington. You're addressing a group of people who have been very, very active and have reached out already. And I'd like a show of hands to just have him know how active we've been. How many people here have tried to reach their local city officials or county officials? And also, we can update. You can see those hands going up right now. And so it's a question of going back to them, is what I think Ira is suggesting right now. And then as far as the union activity, Sean or Harry, you can help fill him in on what we've been doing here.
Actually,
I think Ira's pretty up to date on that.
yeah, Sean and Harry have filled me in about this already, Joanne.
Okay, good.
To some extent, you know, I that's part of the reason why I mentioned it, because I know that you guys have are already doing work in that regard, and just wanted to share the stuff that we've been able to do out here.
Good.
Yeah.
But yeah, to our audience and people listening, we want to talk to labor unions. If you have connections to labor unions, let us know. We are looking to get people to sign on to Back from the Brink and to move their members into action around this issue.
Can I ask those of you who have reached out to your local towns, and have you been successful? If yes, that's great. If no, what kind of objection, what kind of resistance have you encountered? Because we certainly have had mixed experiences in the local work that I'm doing here in Massachusetts.
I can speak for Olympia because there have been repeated appeals to Olympia over the years, whether it was to recognize the anniversary of the TPNW, or whether it was a resolution to support it, or whether it was a resolution to support the International Day on elimination of nuclear weapons, or whether or not it was to support the coming of the Golden Rule here. We just have to be careful in Olympia we don't overdo it. Because they really have been a wonderful council that has been ongoing, giving us ongoing support.
Joe, did you have a comment?
Yeah, in the case of Seattle, we kind of had difficulty getting in, and then the council turned over, and the general reticence is that this is not in their job description. You know, this is not what they do. They don't do resolutions about international issues or national issues. They're just about Seattle. But we went to this when I first started doing this volunteer activity about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I went to the state. And that's very difficult to get anything into the state legislature, because they're very they only meet 3 months out of the year or 4 months out of the year, every other year. I don't know. It's very limited, the number of things that they consider. And we got up to the rules committee, and they said, no, there's too much stuff happening. We can't do this. So they had a capacity issue.
Yeah. Just to comment on that, we're having somewhat the same issue here in Massachusetts, where we have introduced the Back from the Brink resolution in 3 successive 2-year sessions of the legislature, and got it to the final committee this year, but then time ran out. Sort of. We're making a final push. They're having informal sessions between now and the end of the year, and we're doing sort of a full court press to try to get it passed before the end of the year. It's been very frustrating on the one hand. On the other hand, it has given us an ongoing organizational tool, both to mobilize communities to try to get them to pressure their legislators, having the actual conversations with the legislatures, getting the press, starting to get the press involved in reporting on the fact that they're not doing this. And so it's, well, we clearly would have preferred that it go more smoothly and go quicker. It's still been worthwhile activity. The local issue where people, this is not something appropriate for city council. I mean, the only thing that I can suggest on that is that, there are 80 cities that are 75 cities that have said opposite. And generally speaking, almost all those city council votes were unanimous. The biggest issue was getting a hearing before the city council, and finding one or two people who would champion the resolution. And once we got entree, like in the Boston City Council, it took us 4 years, and then we got in and we got a unanimous vote. So don't give up, is what I'm saying. Yeah. Cindy?
Yeah, we had some of the same pushback. This isn't an issue that, we should really take up. We have too many other things. We have homelessness. We have lots going on. But when we first started, we had, probably 2 or 3 people on the council who were pretty interested. And then their thing was, oh, we just don't have time. So I think that since it took you 4 years, we worked on this for a couple of years. We shouldn't give up. So yeah, thanks.
And, there's this idea that this is sort of peripheral and we're dealing with the real issues. Have to have a certain sympathy for it. The real issues are in their face every day. I mean, homeless people, you can put nuclear war out of mind if you try to. You can't ignore the homeless people in your city who are sleeping on the street kind of thing. And I guess, one of the lines that I've heard used is if you don't think this is a local issue, I would please ask you to contact the mayor of Hiroshima. And not said as a snotty sort of thing, but just really, you don't understand. Our cities are the targets. If this happens, and this really can happen, nothing else you're doing in the city is going to matter. So please look at it from that perspective, if you would. That that kind of an appeal to them might be helpful. We have certainly had to present that argument to many individual members of the state legislature who also said this isn't something the state legislature should be involved in. And we haven't convinced everyone, but we've convinced most of the people that we've talked to.
Ira, we have Bangor here. So that's close enough to most of us.
Yeah, and I would think that would be something which would help to overcome that this isn't a local issue.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Bangor is such a gigantic target.
Mm-hmm.
When we were lobbying in the city of Auburn, we found that one of the council members was a downwinder from Hanford, and had her thyroid removed because of the exposure. So yeah, you'd be surprised. You can run into people who have connections a lot more in this state. But I also just wanted to shout out John and Cindy for making a really valiant effort in Bellingham, and we're here to back y'all up. And if the issue doesn't feel pressing to them, it means they're not hearing from enough people. So we can keep making noise. David.
You muted, David.
Thank you. I appreciate your comment that it took, like Cindy said, it took so long. Not that it was a good thing, but that the importance of persisting. Down here in Tacoma, just south of Seattle, there were a couple of people in particular. One came up to me afterwards, after talking back to the presentation, and they were very, very positive. And it was clear to me that they didn't feel like they could share it with among them. But that and they were saying it's not a slam dunk against the situation as it might seem. What seemed on the surface of it was what was on the surface, or beyond the surface actually, was that the mayor asked the city attorney if this was an issue, a nuclear issue that they could contend with. And the city attorney said definitely not. But I appreciate you sharing it. Don't give up, because that really gives me motivation.
You know, and the other thing along those lines I think is important is there has been a change this year in terms of the receptivity of people to hearing about this. You know, the New York Times used to make fun of us for advocating the abolition of nuclear weapons. They have a series now, and there was a new episode in it today called At the Brink. We take credit for the name, and they have called explicitly in this series for the elimination of nuclear weapons. It's a complete change in their editorial policy. The same week that the first episode in that series, At the Brink, appeared in the Times, the Los Angeles Times published an op-ed written by Ernest Moniz, who was the Secretary of Energy in charge of building these weapons, in which he called for the elimination of the weapons that his department has built. And there also at the same time was a statement released by 20 sort of Hollywood A-list types, you know, talking about the urgent need to get rid of nuclear weapons. And of course, there's Annie Jacobson's book that was referred to before, the Nuclear War Scenario, which has gotten an enormous amount of press coverage, something which I don't think it would have gotten 2 years ago. And if it gets made into a movie, it's going to get an even broader audience. So I think there's some real stirrings. Largely due to world events, partially due to the work that we all have done, and we need to build on that.
Thank you.
Hollis.
Thank you, Ira, for all your work and for your name being put forward in just about every venue that I have appreciated. Here in Spokane, Washington, we are doing exactly what you have suggested. We have an ordinance, 36299, which makes nuclear weapons. We are a nuclear weapons free zone, except for national security reasons. And we have had a problem because our purchasing agent, who we just finally met with, said the contracts that we have with so many people here in Spokane, so many businesses, they have to go and analyze them all based on our ordinance. It's onerous. The federal government can track everybody, you know, in the world that's producing nuclear weapons, and they know who everybody in the United States is doing business with. But now we have one purchasing agent who we're meeting with every 2 months, and he says within 6 months he may have a plan to identify the businesses that we are not to do any sort of actions with or investments in. And even that is outdated now, because now Hanford wants to ship nuclear waste in casks of grout and glass through Spokane. So we're trying to tweak the ordinance now. So that's just come up, and the city council is actually, and the mayor is aware of this. But this thing is dynamic. And so what you're talking about, the Department of Energy has no limitation. They're talking out of both sides of their mouth. They say, let's create alternative energy. Let's do solar panels down at Hanford. At the same time, they're promoting 12 small nuclear reactors at Hanford, and they're developing 52 test small nuclear reactors at the Idaho National Laboratory. So it seems to me like our opposition to the annihilation of humanity is taking a second fiddle to the powers that be, who are so suicidal, they would rather blow up the world than lose their capitalistic intentions. In other words, their rich lifestyles. So I put something in the chat. We're dealing with a really great little fellow from Northwestern University named Hiro, and he's got documentation going on. If you want to check it out, and a little staff, and they just now have a website, and they are trying to document every city council in the nation. I think it's limited to the nation that's doing something about this. And here I want to admit that we are so faulty. We cannot get our city council, much less our board of commissioners of the county, to even talk about signing this resolution to have our country join the TPNW. We can't even do that. And we're surrounded by a red environment. We're a little blue dot here in the middle of it. People here are so damn ignorant, they don't understand what the hell's going on here. And so we don't have a big enough movement, is what I'm trying to say. It's not in the public eye enough to matter at all.
You know, House, I think what you're saying is quite true. I'm very glad to hear about this very dynamic process you're involved in sort of getting the city to divest from nuclear enterprises, which is a terrific way of keeping this issue alive and in front of people. I was very involved in negotiating the TPNW. I was on the board of ICAN for 2 years before the treaty was finally signed, and I chaired the session of the United Nations session on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons at the open-ended working group in Geneva that led to the negotiation for the treaty. I think we perhaps are creating an unnecessary problem for ourselves in some ways by insisting that that signing and ratifying the treaty be the thing that we ask the U.S. government to do. This is an extremely unpopular position, even among people who favor the abolition of nuclear weapons, because they feel that it's unilateral disarmament that puts the United States at risk. And this all goes back to this whole idea, which we do need to figure out how to confront, that nuclear weapons somehow make us safe. But the conversation we want to have is not whether unilateral disarmament is good or bad. It's about the need to get rid of all these weapons worldwide. And, Back from the Brink has carefully framed our demand. We don't ask the United States to sign and ratify the treaty. We ask the United States to support the treaty, to support the international movement that this treaty represents, but to take the step which it would need to take in order to be able to sign and ratify the treaty, which is to get the other 8 nuclear armed states to negotiate with it the details which are not included in the treaty on purpose, because we knew that the nuclear states had to negotiate these themselves, to negotiate the details of enforcement, verification, and the specific timetable for eliminating the weapons. And that's how we frame this within Back from the Brink. And I think it is much more palatable to people. And when you present that, you get the discussion you want, which is why we need to get rid of nuclear weapons, not this sort of side discussion about unilateral disarmament versus multilateral disarmament, which is a conversation which does not really help us particularly. So just, in terms of, that's why, again, I think the Back from the Brink resolution may be an easier one in many places to get people to buy onto than a resolution which explicitly is demanding the United States sign and ratify right now, which people view as committing to unilateral disarmament.
Well, I hate to interrupt, but I just came from a World Beyond War webinar. It was 1 hour. David Swanson was on. They're mapping all the bases in the world that the U.S. is promoting. There's no, and recruitment is up in all the military. Last month it was off. Now it's back up again. These guys are manipulating our whole culture in a suicidal manner. And I don't see a national movement taking place. The peace movement is so slow at finding out about this. I have people in my own household that think the mainstream media is telling them the truth. So it's very disconcerting. And so that's what we're looking for, is a huge national campaign. Vets for Peace here has cited complicity in genocide to the entire Congress with legal repercussions based on 7 international laws and rules. And we have presented that to the Congress. They know about that. They're in violation of international law, and they could give a shit about that. So what is the point? If we're not going to be in the streets every day, all the time, I think the laws of attraction, which I'm trying to study now as being a solution to the problem, how can we attract the positive energy that we need to get everybody involved in the idea of our beautiful, peaceful world that we're trying to create? So how can we do that, Ira?
I think we can do that best by helping people understand the incredible danger that nuclear weapons pose to everything that we care about. And, I tend to focus very heavily on this issue. I care about lots of other issues as well. But to my mind, the thing that has the best chance of bringing together large numbers of people, as it did in the 80s during the Freeze campaign, is for people to understand fully what is at risk today if we don't get rid of nuclear weapons. And I think that is our best chance of bringing together a broad movement, a movement that involves even capitalists, which most people in America consider themselves to be at this point, because they're going to lose too. Everyone is. And I think if we frame the conversation in those terms, that the world is at risk, that's our best chance for building the kind of movement that we need. Mary, you had your hand up too? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think though, Ira, we have to take really seriously some changes since those two crises that happened, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the crisis in 1983 that produced the Freeze movement. And that's that the other side benefits so much from the distraction. I mean, the way that communication doesn't happen in this country is really something. I mean, in our area, we have pointed out the fact that Trident is right there, and it's a big target, and that if there's a nuclear war, this area is toast. Okay, we have a tiny movement. It's not that people don't know it, it's that they have to push it down.
Mm-hmm.
The fear, the layer of fear, it's like you and I are old enough to remember the old invisible shield ads on TV, some kind of toothpaste set up an invisible shield. You remember that. Okay. The reason I use that metaphor is it's kind of like the invisible shield has gotten thicker. It's like a clear callus that you encounter. It's like a callus, but you're talking to members of Congress. The only one who's been good on these issues has been Pramila Jayapal. And you look for anything right now in her campaign, her statement about her priorities, anything about militarism, anything about Gaza, anything about nukes, and it's not there because that she dared to go, to stand up to it, to the powers that keep that invisible shield going. So I think what's different between now and back then is that the strength of all of the of what we're up against, all the different forms that it takes, that it has strengthened, and that especially in this area, I mean, I am sad to say, I mean, there are people saying that they are for Trident, that they're for the sea-based nuclear weapons, and they're willing to ignore the problem of inadvertent miscalculation, all of that, and say, oh, well, that we should just focus on Sentinel and not deal with the dangers of the submarine-based nukes. And here we are, we're a target. I'm just saying that's the level of distress that we're dealing with here. This is not some intellectual exercise. This is after decades and decades and decades. I've been at this since 1983 myself, of trying to break through in some way. And we can get lip service, yes. I mean, August 6th, they'll declare that to be, the day for the elimination of nuclear weapons. anything that the politician can do quickly, they'll do. But anything that really breaks through that invisible shield, that I haven't seen yet.
Well, Mary, you're describing the situation in the world, I think, very accurately. We don't have a big movement at this point, and there's very powerful opposition to us. But that doesn't change what our job is, because we know what's going to happen if we don't get rid of these weapons. They're going to get used. So we need to look at these as obstacles to overcome rather than as reasons not to do the work. And I don't mean to imply that you're using this as a reason. You obviously are doing the work. All of you are on this call. But I think we also need to try and to keep this in mind so that we don't get discouraged, because it can be discouraging. We have a difficult. Oh, just let me finish this thought. We have a very difficult problem to deal with at this point, but I think the heart of it is clear. The people who are not paying attention to this, they don't understand. It's not that they know what's going to happen or that they understand that it's going to happen and they don't care. They don't believe it's going to happen, and they don't know how bad it's going to be if it does happen. And that creates an opportunity for us, because we see this all the time. When you are able to sit down with people and get them to understand what is at stake here, they don't want this to happen. And the denial is very strong. People my age who used to know this stuff, who lived through, the Cuban Missile Crisis as kids and who lived through '83 as adults, we knew once how bad stuff was going to be. And we have tried very hard to forget about this because it was so horrible and it was so scary. And when the Cold War ended, we just told ourselves we're not going to worry about this anymore. And there's this real denial. But when you break through that, when you get people to look at it again, and in the case of older people, remind them of what they once knew. In the case of young people who've not been exposed to this, bring the information to them. I think you can, and we have seen that we do get a good result. It's not happening as fast as we'd like it to, but it's happening. And that's all we can do, is keep trying to do this. We're not where we were in 1983, but in 1979, we weren't there either. There wasn't a movement to get rid of nuclear weapons in 1979 in this country. It was tiny. And in a relatively short period of time, we were able to build a very large movement. And there was very strong opposition then as well. There was a Republican Party that controlled the White House that was more aggressively pro-nuke than either party is today. And even so, we were able to build that movement. So, don't get too discouraged.
I don't think you can say that. I'm sorry, Ira. I respect you so much. You got to know that, how much I respect you. But to say to anybody, don't get discouraged, isn't going to work, because the discouraging, I have personal friends who used to go with me on peace marches. We cannot talk about this issue now. It's either the friendship or we can talk about it. That's how bad it is that people who went to the marches, and by marches, I mean anti-war marches and anti-nuclear marches and all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying that I think we have to have compassion for their denial. I think that's where it has to start. Because if we don't have compassion for the fact that they are scared out of their wits, they do know how dangerous this is, and they've set up this stuff in their brain that they think is protecting them, somehow helping them cope. They are trying to cope, and the only way that they see that they can cope is by putting this into a category, and it's the whole progressive caucus. I mean, in Congress,
Mary, please wrap up your comments.
Anti-military and anti-nuke used to be part of their, a part of their agenda. It's been thrown under the bus. And I think we have to have some compassion for ourselves, for our feeling discouraged. It doesn't mean that we don't do the work, but to plug away doesn't strike me as the answer. It seems to me that it's a question, that we have to reopen the question more. I don't see it as an answer. We can tell them.
Mary, we need to move along, please.
Yeah, we can tell them that 60 other cities have signed it. We can tell them that Spokane has signed it, and they put up that invisible shield and say no.
Ira, if you want to respond to that and then move into some closing thoughts. Yeah, thank you for speaking to us.
Sure. Yeah, just very briefly to respond to that, Mary. I think there are people who don't want to talk about it, and you have to respect that. But I think there are a lot of people for whom this is a new issue, or people who did know about it, and are willing to re-engage. And that's my experience when I do the work that we're all doing. There are lots of people out there who are quite willing to engage in this. And our movement is not anywhere near as big as we want it to be, but it is clearly growing significantly. So when I say don't be discouraged, I think that's important. And I don't mean that in a patronizing or condescending sort of way. This is hard work that we're doing, and it is easy to get discouraged. But we have to remember that we have to remind ourselves, we know this, but we need to remind ourselves about it. What's at stake here? There's really only one outcome that is acceptable, which is for us to be successful. If we're not, there's going to be nuclear war. And we need to figure out how to do this well. When we encounter people who just will not talk about this anymore, fine. They're our friends. We care about them. We're not going to talk to them about this issue. We'll talk to other people about it. Just that. Just in closing, I mean, I often talk these days to young people, and I find that personally a little bit difficult because I feel kind of guilty. I mean, these kids have had nothing to do with creating this problem, and it seems somehow unfair that they should have to deal with it. But I'm also inspired because their attitude usually is they may be somewhat angry that this problem's been dropped on them, but they also understand this is their future. And they have the same kind of reaction that they do when talking about the climate crisis. They want to have a future, and they know that there are some real threats to that future that they have to deal with. So I encourage them to look at it also somewhat, as young people perhaps are more easily able to do, with something of a sense of adventure, that this is the greatest challenge that we have ever faced, the greatest threat we've ever faced. And overcoming that threat is going to be one of the great accomplishments of human history. And we all have the opportunity to be part of that. And those of us who've been doing it, as many of you have for many years, I think can take special satisfaction in the work you've done, and hopefully in the success that we're going to have. So again, thanks so much for letting me talk with you tonight. And I wish you all the best in the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ira. Please join me in a virtual round of applause. Yeah, thank you so much. I know we're running a little bit late. We do have a additional speaker or additional speakers. So Glenn and Leonard, if you're ready, I want to give you two the floor.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you so much, Ira Helfand, for your activism and leadership and your work.
Thank you,
It's inspiring. Yes, thank you. So I'm going to I have some slides, and they're let's see. I've rehearsed this thing and everything. Let's see. That's not it. Here, let me get to my screen here.
Glenn, while we're waiting, why don't we give Leonard and yourself a proper introduction?
Yes. I'm with Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action.
So I get back to where I was.
I think Leonard does have a presentation he's trying to get. Leonard and I got to know each other really in 2022 when we started talking about the comic book I was aware of the I Saw It comic book by Keiji Nakasawa, and Ground Zero had actually bought 100 of them in 2013 that we handed out at the submarine base. And NHK, the public network, actually filmed us doing it. And we didn't know this at the time, but it actually came to a class that Leonard had and videotaped him as well. So it looks like he has his, looks like he's ready.
Okay. So thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm very glad to be here. Those are my email addresses. And what Glenn said, I'm here to talk about Ground Zero Comics, Move Beyond Nuclear Weapons, which I wrote, and I co-edited it with Glenn, and I created it with 4 other cartoonists, including Pat Moriarty, who drew that cover. I would like you all to read it, and so Glenn and I rehearsed. He's going to put in the chat the URL for the review copy, which is web posted. And there's also, you can write to us at gzcomics@gzcenter.org for that URL. Although also, besides the digital copy, we do hope you see it on paper, because it's the paper is very nice. I'm so glad to be presenting this to the Washington Against Nuclear Weapons Coalition, because this is a comic that I wrote for people in Washington State about getting rid of nuclear weapons. And I'm hoping it's going to be useful in your work. I'm hoping this is going to be something that you can display when you table, that you might take a handful to your local comic book shop and ask about putting them on consignment. And if it turns out that this comic does not go as far as you like, or goes too far, or goes in a different direction that makes it unsuitable for your activities, then I hope that you'll write a review of it and send me a link so that we can move the conversation forward in that way. This is a panel from the comic that's drawn by David Lasky. So what I'd like to do is talk about 3 steps of how I came to write Ground Zero Comics. So first, how I became a cartoonist, and then how I came to focus on nuclear issues. And then Glenn's already said a little bit about how we came to work with each other on this project. And after that, I'll have just one thing to say about how I present the message in Ground Zero Comics. I became a cartoonist through the underground comics movement of the late 60s and early 1970s. I was one of the youngest cartoonists in that movement, which took a medium which had become just a way of entertaining children, and recognized it as a way that we could explore what we cared about, our fears and desires and hopes, and what we hated and loved, without censorship, freely, for ourselves, for each other, for like-minded young people. So this is a drawing I did for the cover of a comic book 50 years ago about myself and friends having a party. Now, on my screen, I'm looking at people's faces, and it's covering up part of the slide. But you see in the lower right-hand corner, there's a drawing by Robert Crumb, who is the artist most associated with that movement. And that's his most famous character, Mr. Natural. And if you look through Robert Crumb's work, he returns again and again to his anxieties about nuclear war. And he was not alone, because a lot of the cartoonists involved in this movement, when you set them free to talk about what they thought was interesting and important, came back to their fears about nuclear war. The next example is a very obscure comic. It was side-stitched. It wasn't distributed through comic book underground comics channels, but it was published at the University of California, Santa Cruz. More existentialist fun comics. Uncle Sam Says Eat Nuclear Death. The nuclear anxiety coming up all over through these comics. And the reason I'm talking about this one is that it included a 5-page story I did. And you see it on the right part of the screen. It ends in a big mushroom cloud. The story is about this character that goes to the city, and the scientist is trying to prevent the meteor from destroying the city. And the only way he can think to prevent that is to destroy the city before the meteor arrives. This is a time when I was learning how to cartoon, and one of the things I learned was that it takes a lot of work to draw comics, and that I was in particular especially slow. And so it was a problem because I wanted to tell stories that were interesting enough at least to hold my own attention for the time it took to put them on paper. And I came up with the realization that if I wanted to draw something that was really interesting, then I should do something based on fact, because I loved nonfiction, and if it was a story about something non-fictional, more people might be interested in it. The second comic I did like that was inspired by something I just chanced across in the new book section in the library. Um, this was in about 74. I don't think it was The Careless Atom, because that came out in 69. Up to now, nuclear accidents have been relatively minor. How long can we hope to avert a major disaster? It could have been The Atomic Establishment, Poison Power. These are books that were trying to send out a message, trying to get people aroused, trying to alert people to a danger that deserved greater discussion. I thought, well, that would be great to do comic books to serve that kind of a purpose. So I created a comic book to explain the hazards and problems associated with nuclear power. And on the left side of the screen, that was the first printing in 1976. And I could not find anybody to publish it. And so I thought, well, I've drawn the whole thing. Should I just put the artwork in the closet and move on to the next thing? But by then, I had become convinced that these were serious questions. There had to be larger discussion. There had to be more public awareness. And so I looked in the bank balance, and I had enough to print 10,000 copies in black and white. And I did, and it succeeded. And so in the middle of the screen, you see the second, third, and fourth printings were co-published with Last Gasp. And on the right, there was the fifth printing in 1980. And that was the last printing because the movement had grown from practically nothing to succeeding so well that it fell apart. This is an example from the comic. I didn't realize when I did Ground Zero Comics, where I have a crow and a squirrel explaining the issues to the main character. It's not that far from what I was doing all the way back then, where I had a three-legged frog who was the main expert on nuclear energy. So because that comic book succeeded, I developed a specialty in anti-nuclear comic books. And I imported an anti-uranium mining comic from Australia called Atomic Horror Comic. I imported an anti-uranium mining comic from Canada, Nuclear Dragons Attack. I distributed a book-length comic against nuclear power that had been created in Sweden. And Last Gasp created a special issue of their series Slow Death on atomic power, and I distributed that. On the right hand side of the screen, you see an ad for what my company, Educomics, was distributing. And most of it, in one way or another, was related to nuclear issues. And the cover at the top of that ad was for an unusual comic book, Gen of Hiroshima. I learned about the work of a cartoonist in Japan, Keiji Nakazawa, who had survived the Hiroshima bombing when he was 6 years old and grown up to be a professional cartoonist, and then created a long series, Hadashi no Gen, thousands of pages long, in which he told a fictionalized version of his experiences. And it was, while I was negotiating the rights to put this out as a comic book, it came out the first couple of 100 pages, the first volume of it in book form. But I knew that the people in the comic book world that I was part of were not going to pay attention to it until it was a comic book. And so on the left, the cover there is drawn by Pete Poplaski, an American cartoonist, imitating Nakazawa's style. On the right, you see Nakazawa drew the cover for the second issue. And these were the first Japanese manga that were republished in American comic book format. And then I discovered, I wish somebody had told me, that Nakazawa had created a nonfiction version of his life story that was short enough to republish not as a series of comic books, but in one issue, Ori wa Mita. I saw it. And so I dropped the Gen of Hiroshima series, and I decided to publish this. But I decided, again, at this period, I really wanted to use these comic books not only to raise awareness about nuclear war issues, but to tell cartoonists and comic book creators and publishers what could be done with our medium, what powerful work could happen in a comic. And I wanted it to really be seen as an American comic book, and that meant coloring it. It was originally in black and white. At that time, to print a comic in color, the minimum press run was 50,000 copies. Jennifer Hiroshima had been publishing in 5,000 copies, and they'd been selling very slowly. But I decided that this had to be done, and I'm not a great salesman, but I will say that it took me 40 years to go through the 50,000 copies. And when I did, I told Last Gasp, I said, the rights are going to be available. Would you like to publish an edition of I Saw It? And they did. It came out this year. Also this year, Keiji Nakazawa won the Eisner Award at the San Diego Comic Book Convention, the comic book's highest honors, posthumously, unfortunately. So that was kind of the end of my publishing career for a while. The next couple of slides talk about what I did since then. In 1988, I edited a comic book series for Fantagraphics, which since then has become one of the most important publishers in the history of comics. Their publisher, Gary Groth, was also the recipient of the Eisner Award at the San Diego Comic Convention this year. And the first issue of the comic series they invited me to edit, I decided to make about nuclear war issues. And you see a few samples from the story I did on Nuclear Winter, story I wrote and researched and wrote and drew. I also became a comics historian and a college instructor. These are some covers of comic books that came out during the Korean War. And these were sold on newsstands, but you see the propagandist content was very direct. Only a strong America can prevent atomic war, the war that will never happen if America remains strong and alert. And I have a chapter about these comic books in my book, Korean War Comic Books, which you can get from your library. I was able to keep creating comics thanks to a number of organizations that hired me to put their messages into comic book format. The Institute for Food and Development Policy hired me to write and draw Food First comics. It's on the left there with a cover by Steve Leialoha, which exploded the myth of scarcity as being the reason for hunger. The People of Color Against AIDS Network hired me to write and draw AIDS News. I drew the cover of that one, that's in the middle there. And WashDoc hired me to write and draw tobacco comics for school kids, and that cover is by Jim Woodring. And so when Glenn Milner said to me in an email that he wanted to know what it would take for Ground Zero to have their own comic book with a history like that, you can imagine how thrilled I was. It's because it was the opportunity I had been waiting for a long time. And as he said, the reason why we were in contact was because they had been passing out copies of Keiji Nakazawa's I Saw It at the submarine base. So I have just one thing to say about Ground Zero Comics. And I'm going to read it off from my copy here because your faces are covering up the text here, which is fine. On page 29, once Gorbachev and Reagan agreed that nuclear war could not be won and must never be fought, the Soviet Union was able to cut way down on military spending. The first nuclear arms race did not end because the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. It peaked 5 years earlier in 1986. Much of the credit for stopping the drift toward nuclear war belongs to the millions of ordinary people around the world who joined or supported mass movements to demand peace and nuclear disarmament. And yet, although the number of warheads dropped, the danger of a global disaster is greater now than it has ever been. And that's what Ira Helfand was talking about. We're in a moment of tremendous, enormous danger. And we also have this history of success to look back on and to try to learn from and to try to apply. So that, and yet, the key two words on this. The trick with a comic book that's attempting to get people active on an issue is to put people in that space in between complacency where they don't need to do anything and despair, which there's nothing to be done. They're so hopeless. So in this part of the comic book story, should we be stirring you up, or has this already got you down? And that's an example of the artwork of Max Clotfilter, who is the other artist on this book. And so the back cover is one that I drew. On the screen, you see that same graph again, a graph I've used in a number of comics. 40 years ago, a huge popular movement against nuclear weapons helped end the first nuclear arms race. Now a new nuclear arms race has begun. Most of us do not have a realistic idea of what nuclear weapons can do. Most of us do not have a realistic idea of how much power ordinary people have when working together. Read Ground Zero comics. I hope you will. I hope you've that link worked to the review copy. And it also says here that the notes and sources, the documentation, ideas, fun facts, further thoughts, activities are posted at the Ground Zero Center organization website. And I hope that this group especially might find something useful there. So again, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you, and happy to answer any questions.
Excellent work, gentlemen. And we are a bit behind time, but we can allow, I think, 1 or 2 questions as long as they're brief. Hollis, brief.
Yes, I have copies of Ground Zero, and I bought an entire bundle and distributed it at our Hiroshima Memorial here in Spokane, Washington. So thank you for that. And I also am working with the depleted uranium landmines and cluster munitions working group with Veterans for Peace, and we are trying to find a way to get a message out, and we think comics is the only way to do it. So I'm hoping to find a way to contact you.
I'd love to talk with you about that. My email is at the beginning of the slides, but it's leonard.rifas@gmail.com.
Thank you.
Looking forward to hearing from you.
Lynn.
And just a quick question. What's the youngest age that you would think would be appropriate for reading your comics?
I tested a draft of this comic with my college students last spring, and I asked them that question, and their guess was middle school.
Yeah. Seems right. I have not read your comics, but I appreciate the invitation to do so. And just from what you've presented, that sounds right. And I think it's so important to not create fear within them, but a reality of what the world is and how we're working to make it better. Thank you so much.
My 11-year-old grandson read it, and I think he understood it, and he thought it was a very good read.
Good to know.
Excellent. Well, let's thank our speakers. Again, another virtual round of applause. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really on us to distribute these comments or these comics, and you know, buy a bundle, take them with you whenever you're doing your outreach work. You know, call your
discount
local
rates
store.
available.
Yeah. This is a great way to get our message out. So yeah, thank you again, Leonard and Glenn.
So, thank you.
All right, now for our actual business. I just want to give a brief report back on the September 26th action that happened outside of Boeing in South Seattle. About a dozen activists gathered outside of the Boeing Museum of Flight near their Seattle complex. We spoke about the need to pressure companies profiting off of nuclear weapons, waved signs at traffic, and wanted to walk to the Boeing ICBM silo that they have at their parking lot, but they unfortunately beefed up their security, so we were unable to do that. There were about as many police officers and security guards as there were demonstrators. So I think we had some limited effect in, getting them to notice what we were doing. So yeah, I just want to thank those of you who came out to that demonstration, and also special thanks to the Resist US-led war group who has been working to pressure Boeing and gave us some information about ways to do that. Next, I want to pass it to Harry to give a little report back on the Back from the Brink efforts.
Cool. All right, yeah, I wanted to give a quick update, and then I had 3 quick requests for how we can all support Back from the Brink. And just a quick reminder for anyone who might not be as familiar with Back from the Brink, we're a national coalition that's building a grassroots movement across the country, urging our government to take serious steps to reduce the risk of nuclear war and also pursue a world free of nuclear weapons. And our coalition here in Washington State is a proud supporter of that of the National Back from the Brink Coalition. So just to give a quick update, in the last month, we've been showing up in person to build relationships with some strategic organizations. I was just at an SEIU 775 picket and an LD Democrats meeting last night. And Louise and Joe have been doing a great job with canvassing to meet new members. A new member named Anne has been helping with outreach to faith communities, and Jonathan has been helping with outreach to unions and faith communities as well. And top requests right now for how we can all support Back from the Brink, especially in the Seattle area, we're starting to make more presentations about Back from the Brink at membership-based groups, and actually not just about Back from the Brink, but also about our statewide coalition, at groups that are more politically connected. Like Joanne and I made a presentation at a Rotary Club, and Joanne's component of that was about TPNW, and mine was about Back from the Brink. And I have a presentation now scheduled with a legislative district Democratic Party group, and the presentation has been going really well so far. But honestly, we'd be able to make a lot more of them if we had more people available to help make the presentation. So we have a script and a PowerPoint, which you're obviously free to revise, and I can help you prep for that. But this is one of the fastest ways to grow our movement and our coalition, and ultimately help us put a lot more pressure on our political leaders. So just by a quick show of hands, would anyone here be interested in co-presenting with me at a local organization, or potentially have someone in your organization who might be interested? Cool. I saw Leonard, Hollis. Is there anyone else I'm not seeing? Okay, I'll follow up with you both. That's awesome. Other request I want to make was Mona and I are going to be tabling for our statewide coalition on Back from the Brink at the busiest light rail station in South Seattle next Tuesday at 5. That's also a great way to network and bring more people into our coalition. So I'm going to drop the details in the chat, but please let me know if you'd like to join that. We might also grab a snack afterwards. And quick question for the group. We've been building up to this campaign that we're launching now about getting Back from the Brink resolution through the King County Council. And this coming week, we're planning to reach out to 2 council members Teresa Mosqueda and Jermaine Zahile, to ask them to introduce this resolution. We've got about 7 groups on our sign-on letter and growing. And we think this is a great way to show the federal government where King County is at on this, and also keep building our movement as well. And I wanted to ask if any of us here on this call would have any connections to those 2 council members, because we want to give our coalition the best chance of getting a response from them. So do any of us have any connections to Teresa Mosqueda's office or Jermaine Zahile's office? Okay, no worries. I think Alpana from Seattle Indivisible has one, so just wanted to check with our coalition. And that's it from me, unless there's any quick questions. Oh, wonderful. So glad to hear that, Gu. Okay, well, I'll pass it back to you, Sean.
Awesome. Great work, Harry. Yeah. Shaping up to be a real field organizer, which I think we've needed for a long time. Yeah, next up, I wanted to let folks know that many of us have been thinking through ways of regalvanizing our movement. And one idea that's really risen to the top is hosting a large conference next year aimed at, more at the Pacific Northwest, but trying to bring in big speakers like Ira Helfand, who we just had, and others. So we've reached out to the Seattle Archdiocese office, who's launched a new partnership for peace, the Washington Marshallese Community Association, Veterans for Peace, many folks in our coalition about jointly planning that and eventually sponsoring it. But we will be having a first meeting next week. That's going to be Wednesday, the 16th at noon, to begin planning this and jointly crafting how this is going to take shape. So it's something that we're really excited about. If you're interested, reach out. I will also send a reminder through our Google group if you're subscribed to that. So yeah, I think Joanne might have a few things to add as well, if you'd like.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that if anyone is Presbyterian, the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship has already partnered with this by unanimous vote. So they are very much looking forward to it, and I am too.
Awesome. Yeah, are there any questions about that?
Oh, does anyone have any contact with the university meeting, the University Presbyterian Church? No? Okay.
All right. Seeing none, we're just going to roll into coalition updates. So if you are a representative of a coalition and have an update about what you're working on,
Oh, here.
here's your chance.
Can I continue? Yeah.
Maybe let's stop to Beth and then we'll hop back to you.
Yeah, okay.
Mine's quick. I want to invite you tomorrow, Friday at 3. Mona and I are organizing a bannering of Abolish Nuclear Weapons and flyering, and it's at the overpass over Rainier Avenue and Martin Luther King. We've been there before. It's a really good place. The Franklin High School students get out and go over to the Mount Baker light rail station. So that's why we're doing it at that time. Anybody's welcome to join us. We've done that in the past. It's really a good way to connect with young people and staff from the school and other people. So that's tomorrow, 3 o'clock. Call me or Mona if you have questions.
Excellent. Back to you, Joanne.
I just wanted for people who came on board a little bit later, the memorial for Glenn Anderson, I posted details in the chat for anyone who is interested in joining us. It's going to be on Friday, the 18th, and it'll be a bannering, typical bannering. These are things that Glenn would be very happy doing with us. So he'll be there in spirit. There'll be the bannering, the potluck, which he loves, and then a memorial wheel, which hopefully he'll enjoy listening to in his own state.
Thank you. Just reading from the chat, No More Bombs is tabling in Bellingham for the showing of First They Bombed New Mexico, which is great. I attended a showing in Gig Harbor recently, met the filmmaker and met a couple downwinders, including one that is local and wants to get involved in our work. So really great opportunity to teach folks through film and that experience. Any other updates? Dan, when is the next reading group?
One second. Okay. If you can hear me, we are having our next meeting of the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Reading Room this coming Tuesday at 7:30. We will be covering the second half of Richard Rhodes' classic history, The Making of the Atomic Bomb.
Excellent. Excellent. And I think while we have y'all here, Samantha or Andy, would either of you want to introduce yourselves, our guests from Oregon?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Palladini. I use she, her pronouns, and I am Oregon PSR's Peace and Justice Program Manager. We're starting up or rebuilding our Peace and Justice Action Team. So happy just to be invited and get to see what you all are working on. And sounds really just inspiring and great. And I loved the speakers and yeah, looking for ways to be more involved and work with you all as a collaborative, Pacific Northwest.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. We're really excited to have Oregon folks more involved. All right, if there's nothing else, our final ask of the evening would be for each and every one of you to do one thing to educate your organization about nuclear weapons. Two easy things you could do. We have two small letter campaigns, one of which centers around canceling the Sentinel ICBM program. So you follow that link I just put in the chat. It would be a good opportunity to raise that with your group and say, here's this expensive, wasteful program for land-based missiles. Can you write your member of Congress about opposing it? The other campaign we have going is continuing to call on Congress to pass the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which is being blocked in the House by Speaker Mike Johnson. It has bipartisan support, so we really want our members of Congress doing all they can to get around that big obstacle of a person. So I hope everybody can commit to doing that in the next month, and we will check in next month to hear how it went. So there you go, accountability. Any final announcements? Going once, going twice. All right, it looks like we're going to end pretty close to on time. So thanks everybody for coming out. We will be back in November. And again, we're meeting to plan a conference for spring of 2025 next Wednesday. So stay tuned.
Great. Thank you, Sean.
Have a good night, y'all.
Bye.
Night. Bye.
Thanks, Leonard. Like it. Really quite informative. I've got a 12-year-old grandson that I'm going to talk to his parents about having him read it.